As we continue our journey through 1 Samuel, we come to a scene that in some ways would be kind of comical for us, not very comical for the Philistines, as they think that they've won this great victory over the Israelites, but even more so, they think that their god Dagon has defeated Yahweh, the God of Israel. And they're about to get a rude awakening that God was simply chastising his people and allowing the ark to be captured. And so we'll begin to see how they try to work their way through and figure things out and try to use their best religious minds to figure out a way to put the anger of God aside, our God. I'll be reading from the English Standard Version, chapters 5 and part of chapter 6 of 1 Samuel. When the Philistines captured the ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside Dagon. And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and they put him back in his place. But when they rose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward again on the ground before the ark of the Lord, and this time the head of Dagon and both of his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. This is why the priests of Dagon and all who enter the house of Dagon do not tread on the threshold of Dagon and Ashdod to this day. The hand of the Lord was heavy against the people of Ashdod, and he terrified and afflicted them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory. And when the men of Ashdod saw how things were, they said, "The ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is hard against us and against Dagon our God." So they sent and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines and said, "What shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel?" They answered, "Let the ark of the God of Israel be brought around to Gath." So they brought the ark of the God of Israel there. But after they had brought it around, the hand of the Lord was against that city, causing a very great panic. And he afflicted the men of the city, both young and old, so that tumors broke out on them. So they sent the ark of God to Ekron. But as soon as the ark of God came to Ekron, the people of Ekron, that's not Ekron, cried out, "They have brought around to us the ark of the God of Israel to kill us and our people." They sent therefore and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines and said, "Send away the ark of the God of Israel. Let it return to its own place, that it may not kill us and our people." For there was a deathly panic throughout the whole city, and the hand of God was very heavy there. The men who did not die were struck with tumors, and the cry of the city went up to heaven. Chapter 6, the ark of the Lord was in the country of the Philistines 7 months. And the Philistines called for the priests and the diviners and said, "What shall we do with the ark of the Lord? Tell us what we shall, and we'll send it to its place." And they said, "If you send away the ark of the God of Israel, do not send it empty, but by all means return him a guilt offering. Then you will be healed, and it will be known to you why his hand does not turn away from you." And they said, "What is the guilt offering that we shall return to him?" They answered, 5 golden tumors and 5 golden mice, according to the number of the lords of the Philistines, for the same plague was on all of you and on your lords. So you must make the images of your tumors and the images of your mice that ravage the land. It's just too funny. And give glory to the God of Israel. Perhaps he will lighten his hand from off you and your gods in your land. Why should you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened their hearts? After he had dealt severely with them, did they not send the people away and they departed? Now then, take and prepare a new cart, and 2 milk cows on which there has never come a yoke. And yoke the cows to the cart, but take their calves home away from them, and take the ark of the Lord and place it on the cart, and put in a box at its side the figures of gold, which you are returning to him as a guilt offering. Then send it off and let it go its way, and watch. If it goes up on the way to its own land, to Beth Shemesh, then it is he who has done us this great harm. If not, then we shall know that it's not his hand that struck us. It happened to us by coincidence or chance. The men did so and took 2 milk cows and yoked them to the cart and shut up their calves at home. They put the ark of the Lord on the cart and the box with the golden mice and the images of their tumors. I wonder how they modeled for that. And the cows went straight in the direction of Beth Shemesh along one highway, lowing as they went. They turned neither to the right nor to the left. And the lords of the Philistines went after them as far as the border of Beth Shemesh. May God add his understanding to this reading from his word. The Philistines, we believe, probably were a group of people that came from the area in Crete or near Crete. They were not Semites, they were not from that area, but they had settled somewhere close to the time the Israelites had. They had superior technology to the Hebrew people at this time. They knew how to smelt iron. And they felt that they were the ones, oh boy, that they had won this battle. And in winning the battle, they read from it the wrong thing. It might be an easy thing, though, to think, right? We won, so our God is greater than Israel's God. That's what they thought. And capturing the ark, which apparently the people, when they were running from the battle in Ebenezer, all the way back to Shiloh and wherever else their homes were, they forgot to bring the ark, or maybe they were just running for their lives so much because they were being so soundly defeated that they left it there to be captured. The very symbol of the presence of God in their midst, the very ark that had been created with very, very careful instruction from God himself, how it was to be and what it really symbolized, that it meant that God would hover essentially, spiritually at least, over the mercy seat, the place where they could come for mercy, where they would find forgiveness, where their sins could be forgiven, and where it understood that the glory of God shined where that ark had been. The people's love for God, their appreciation for what he had done, their memory of what he had done in the wilderness surely must have grown cold at this time. Certainly it had among some of their leaders. And so Hophni and Phinehas were struck down. The ark is captured. And as we said last week, the people thought, oh, the glory is departed. Certainly Eli's daughter-in-law with her dying breath, the glory is departed. Ichabod, that's what it means, the glory of God. But the glory of God had not departed. He had just tried to teach them a lesson of what his holiness really means. And he was about to begin, as we again talked about before, this whole new era. There was a new thing he was going to be doing. It would set up all the way the pathway to the cross that Jesus would die on, the mercy seat that we now know. The Philistines had no clue how to treat the God of Israel. And so they think they've won, that their God is bigger. When I was a kid, we used to have this little thing we did. I can remember our next door neighbor and one on the other side. And there was always this argument about who moved into their house first, because it was a whole new development. And they were like, oh, well, no, we moved in first. No, we moved in first. And there was always also kind of the ideas of, well, my dad's better than your dad. On Father's Day, that's a good thing to think about, right? And so the Philistines are saying that Dagon, which is simply a statue, is greater than the God who they had heard about. Back in one of the earlier chapters, we heard of how they, in fact, it was chapter 4, they were in terror of the Israelites when that ark had come into the camp of Israel, because they had heard what God had done to the Egyptians, the only superpower of its time. The Assyrians were not really very powerful then. They were going to be, but they weren't yet. And it was just a time where Egypt was the only real power, and they were absolutely vanquished by this God who was represented by the Ark of the Covenant. And that Ark of the Covenant contained the very 10 commandments that God said were the very basis of society that he would have with his people. Obey these things, have no other gods before me, make no graven images, serve only me. And the blessings will come, and they'll come, and they'll come. But he warned them sternly in other places in the 5 books of Moses that if they were to serve other gods, they would have those tumors. They would have the boils. They would be afflicted. They would be a laughingstock to the world. He'd been clear. The Philistines don't know God at this time. They don't know how powerful he really is. It's not in the ark. It's the God who was represented by the ark, who is invisible, who is spirit. And so it's interesting that they come in the morning and they find, thinking that, well, everything's going to be as we left it last night when we put the ark in here at the side of Dagon to be his helper, that God would be, because he was vanquished, just a helper. He was in subservience, they thought, to this God of stone that they loved and served. And what do they find? It's at the time of prayer, the time when the Israelites would be coming in to offer themselves in worship to God, that they find Dagon face down on the ground, essentially in a posture of worship and subservience to the one true God, the only real God. The God who had revealed himself to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who had led the people through the wilderness. And they had heard the stories, but they didn't seem to get it. And one of the commentators points out that there's actually perhaps a thing embedded here where it says they had to pick him up and put him back in his place. What kind of a God is it that can't pick himself up? He's just stone. He's just a thing. And so they put him in his place, and the next day he falls over, same position, in reverence for God, but now his head and his hands have been cut off. This was a common thing. It's a hard thing for us in modern times to think about, because we wouldn't be that brutal. We're not supposed to desecrate a body, even of our worst enemies. But they used to do it routinely. It was a way of showing the count of how many people they had defeated in battle. They would cut off a hand, or they'd cut off the head. This case, it's the God of this false God. It's his head and his hands that have been cut off before the God of Israel. And the whole thing with this thing about idolatry in itself, we read about it in Deuteronomy 32, that basically the idols of the ancient world, of any false gods, are really demons that want worship. They are a part of Satan's host of people, and they're seeking worship. So there may not be any real gods, but there are things parading as gods that have nowhere near the power of the real God, the only God. They're created creatures, but a lot of the whole things of idolatry seem to be demonic in nature, and there are people serving, I think, false gods now. I hear it often, people, and I generally agree with what people say when they say, look, we all serve, there's only one God. Well, they're doing well when they say that. That's, the Bible says that, there's only one God. Now, we understand him to be a triune God. But is it the same God that we serve if we have a whole different thing that we mean by God? If we mean by God the one that supposedly told terrorists to fly into the World Trade Center and into the Pentagon, that's not God. That's a lie. That's a false picture of God. And I'm not saying, by the way, that all people of that faith would ever do that, because of the radical end of that whole thing. If we mean by God that you and I are God, that God is everything and everything is God, that's not God. You and I are creatures. We are created beings. We are not gods. We may try to pretend to be him sometimes, but we can never be divine. We can only be in the divine image. We're created in his image, and that needs to be enough. And so there's whole parts of the world, with all due respect to them, and they have all kinds of culture and all kinds of things, but the reality is that's not a picture of the God who alone is God. The God that we know revealed himself in Jesus Christ. And all of these things that are happening here are really a preamble. They're getting ready for him to keep revealing himself. It's a kind of a paradise lost. There was a time, according, at least if we trust the scriptures, and I do, where humans understood who God was. Adam and Eve had conversations with God regularly. They knew who he was face to face. But when they sinned, they began to create themselves a God in their own image. They began the process of idolatry. And so it was knowledge that was lost, and God would have to break through all of that, and he goes to this idol maker, Abraham, and says, stop making the idols. I know it's lucrative, but you're not going to make them anymore. You're going to follow me. I want you to, he's 75 years old, he says, I just want you to go wherever I tell you to go. I'll tell you when you get there. And he starts going to the west. He has a happy life, but he's told to go. That's the first he reveals himself to Noah to protect the human race, because God still had a plan for you and me. He loved Noah. But then Abraham, and then Isaac and Jacob. He reveals himself who he is, but always as a God who's holy, who's not to be trifled with, not to be made fun of, not to be put in the temple with a false demonic image of something that doesn't exist. And so the hand of God was heavy against them, and they break out in tumors. And some of them die. And they're now in fear. And they, instead of picking up from that, we were talking about this just last night and this morning, Elizabeth and I. They had a choice, the Philistines did. They could have said, Dagon is an idiot. Dagon's false. That's no God. Look, he can't protect himself. We had to pick him up and put him there. By the way, we made him. Right? They could have said that. And they could have learned from this, especially as they moved the ark around from city to city, and they see the devastation that's wrought by treating God in an unholy way. Maybe we should follow that God. Maybe we should contact our Israelite neighbors and say, who is this God that's taken you through the wilderness? Our God is false. But they don't. For whatever reason, their minds just are not ready to receive him. But they could have had that opportunity, I think, at least theoretically. They just never even think of that. Let's get him away so we can protect Dagon. And we'll still honor the threshold where his hands and his head were cut off and laid. They read the wrong message. They want to do something religious instead of something faithful. God doesn't want us to just do what we want religiously and think that we are honoring him. He's told us how to worship him. He's told us what he wants from us. He wants us to love him. And he's lovable. But he's not safe. He's holy. He's so far above our ways and our knowledge and our being. He's the one who extended the heavens. He's the one who placed the stars where they are, the Pleiades and Orion. He put them there poetically anyway with his finger. The panic that breaks out was predicted in Deuteronomy 7:23. It says, but the Lord your God, me speaking of Israel's enemies, will give them over to you and throw them into great confusion until they're destroyed. And the Philistines have brought this on themselves by treating God in an unholy and a mocking way. God will not be mocked. And by the way, the tumors were predicted in Deuteronomy 28:27. The Lord will strike you with the boils of Egypt and with tumors and scabs and itch of which you cannot be healed. He's saying that to his own people if they start running after those other gods like Dagon or Baal. Dagon came to be understood as the father of Baal. Baal was the god of fertility and of storm. And in some sense, they think that Dagon might have been a storm god too, at least in the ideas of the people that created this whole mythology. And so they decide, well, okay, it's not going so well in Gath either. We're all getting sick. Let's get rid of this thing. Send it over to Ekron. And Ekron gets it, and they see it coming, and now they know. They know it's not a God to be trifled with, but they won't obey him. They won't seek him. They won't change their false God, which they have only recently probably adopted, because Dagon is a Semitic kind of a deity. And they're not Semites, so they've adopted him. They haven't even believed in him for all that long, in all likelihood. I love the way one commentator describes this whole scene. The Philistine soldiers had prevailed over Israelite forces, they believed, because Dagon had proven superior to Yahweh on the divine battlefield, or so they thought. Thus, it was fitting that Yahweh should exist as an attendant in the household of Dagon, just as Israel would serve Philistia. Early the next morning, though, at the time of the day prescribed in the Torah for the first daily act of worship toward the Lord, Dagon was found in a posture of reverence and submission before the ark of the Lord. Their God, thought to be so virile on the battlefield, meaning Dagon, in the confines of his own dwelling, did not even have the strength to lift his face out of the dust. They had to do it for him, because he's a false god, the invention of demons who want us to follow their ways and not God's ways still. So they get the council together. They do it a couple of times. That's how they get the thing going on the road to Gath. Now the people down in Ekron call for another council meeting. And they get them together after 7 months of torture. And they say, well, look, I think we ought to send this back. That's no small thing, because they thought they had won the battle, but now they're afraid of this God, and they know that they're sending him back to their own people. It's a kind of an admission of defeat when they thought they were victors. And so they call for the priests and the diviners. Right? The diviners are the soothsayers, the seers, the people that probably looked at the liver of animals to figure out the future. And they look to them. They don't call upon the Israelite priests to find out, how do we really treat this tar? They probably could have. They could have, I don't know if they had a white flag back then, but they could have somehow approached them maybe and said, look, we're going to send the ark back. Is there a proper way to do that? But they don't do that. They turn to their own religious leaders, and they get terrible advice. It's really terrible, because it's really offensive to God, exactly how they tried to appease him. And they think they're doing a good thing. And there are many people today who think they're serving God with anything that they do, but they've never read the book. They've never read to let God reveal himself to them more fully so that they can honor him the way he wants to be honored. What does God want from you and me? In John's gospel, it talks so much about this, how the Son glorifies the Father and the Father glorifies the Son. The Father wants us to worship him. He wants us to worship his Son. He wants us to love Jesus and serve him and do what he says. It's not that hard, but another way maybe it is. It won't happen by just mere effort. It really means a transformation of our hearts, of our minds, of our souls. It's truly a new birth. Jesus describes it that way to Nicodemus, a religious leader who should have known. Nicodemus doesn't get it. He thinks, what, do I have to climb back into my mother's womb? I'm a grown man. How am I going to do that? He didn't seem to understand yet, but he will later, I think. It's a spiritual renewal. It's a renewing of our heart and mind. It's a change of focus. It's helping us to serve God rather than ourselves and worship our own images and our own things that we want or desire. So they decide they're going to fashion these graven images. Remember where we hear about them? It's Exodus chapter 20, verse 4 in that 10 Commandments where it says, "Thou shalt make no graven images, bow down to nothing except to God, who's invisible." And they know they need to do a guilt offering, that they've offended God, but they're trying to manipulate him. They're trying to bribe him with gold. God doesn't care about gold. He paves the street with it. I wish we had enough of it here to pave the parking lot, because it's not going to take the whole thing into heaven. It won't help us, right? But people live their whole life serving for gold. And you'll never take it with you. So they make 5 gold tumors, 5 lumps that look somewhat like a tumor. It's ridiculous. It's truly ridiculous. And they make 5 mice. And they don't apparently open the ark, thank goodness, because they would have probably not survived that. And they put them on an ox cart. Now they want to give it, this is like having a brand new hearse, or a brand new cart, so that they're in their own funny way trying to pay homage or honor to this God. But it was forbidden to put the ark on a cart. It was only to be carried by specific priests from a specific clan with long poles that it's been carefully covered over, and nobody's supposed to open that lid and look inside, and we're going to find that out if we look at next week's text, that even God's people didn't seem to know that. And they decide that they're going to check it out. We want to know, is this real? Or is it just a funny coincidence that we all got these tumors and the Dagon fell over twice, and the second time he's broken in pieces? It's amazing. So they devise a plan. And, you know, I don't know that much about cows. I have to say, I had one named after me once. It was named Kendra the cow, around 1970. And that cow is long gone now, I'm sure, 50 years later. But I did have one named after me. But apparently, if they've never learned how to, they haven't been trained with a yoke to lead something. And usually, I don't know if they really use cows for doing that. More oxen, I would think, maybe. I don't know. Not a cow expert. But apparently, the cows would know that their calves wanted to be fed. And so they set up this test. So they lock up, they put in the pen the calves that are probably calling out, wanting to be fed, and they put the yoke on them, and they just say, they kind of whack them and tell them to go off wherever you want to go, and we'll see. If you go to Israel, we know that this is really God, and it's been his hand. If it just kind of goes back into our own territory, then the whole thing is just a lucky thing, or unlucky from their perspective. Very clearly, they weren't supposed to do it that way. And so there are no graven images. And by the way, rats are especially offensive to God, apparently. I'm not that crazy about them myself. It says in Leviticus 11, 29 to 30, and these are unclean to you among the swarming things that swarm on the ground: the mole rat, the mouse, the great lizard of any kind, the gecko. So much for that commercial. The monitor lizard, the lizard, and the sand lizard, and the chameleon. These are unclean to you among all that swarm. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be unclean until the evening. So they send a gift to this God, a gift he would never want. Now, I remember as a kid, you buy something for your dad, you're only 9 or 10, so you don't have a lot of money. And you might buy him a tie that you can afford that he would probably not want to wear to work. But he might put it on when he goes out the door, but my guess would be that he would change it when he gets there, Because a dad needs to show affirmation and kindness to their children, even if they don't like the gift they get, right? I mean, I used to give my grandmother's Jean Naté every year, and it would sit in the bottle for years on the back of the, I don't know if she even liked Jean Naté, but it's what I could afford, and my heart was in it. And their heart's not in it. They're simply trying to assuage God's anger. And instead, they're probably making them even more angry. Because the only real sacrifice, well, it would have been ideally, if they were doing a sin offering in Israel, they would have had a lamb. If they couldn't afford a lamb, the law permitted that they could have 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons so that the poor could participate and bring a sacrifice. And if they didn't have that, they could bring 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour and give that to God. But that's not what the Philistines do. They try to bribe God with gold. Gold cast in the idea of something that's offensive to him. What do? Do we love God? Do we come and we worship him with our whole heart and mind and soul? Do we pay attention to what he says? And if we never read the book, we'll never know that much more about him. And really, 20 or 30-minute sermon a week isn't probably going to get you as much as you really need to know, right? I mean, I hope it's helpful. I really do. But God tells us how to worship him, and he tells them who he is. He reveals himself to us continually if we're only willing to listen. And he did it in stages because he knew they couldn't handle it all at once. And so there's what we call progressive revelation. It's not the evolution of religion. That's kind of a human thing of trying to examine how things evolve. This is the idea that there really is someone on the other end of the line. When you call to God, that it's not somebody you've made up who's some father image in the sky, as Freud might say, the ideal father. He is the ideal father because he's the creator. And he's real. And he doesn't want us to worship him in a way or have ideas about who he is that are contrary to who he reveals himself to be. We don't get to vote. I once picked a guy up when I was in seminary. Might have been college, actually, before seminary. I had a book about the wisdom literature. It's sitting on the seat, and I picked this guy up in my hometown. And he's like, "What's that about?" And I said, "Well, it's about the Bible." He says, "Oh, I don't believe in that stuff. And I don't believe in God either." He says, "I just think that we make God in our own image." And I said, "You know what? We do." I think he looked surprised, because what kind of seminary student would agree with that? But we do it. We're tempted to do it. We don't have to do it, but we're tempted to make the God that we want to serve rather than the one who wants us to serve him. Does that make sense? He's holy. He sets it up because it's rooted in his nature. God is glorified in 2 different ways. He's glorified through salvation of those who will return and come to him and find forgiveness. And that's his highest aspiration for anyone. But he's also glorified when somebody who does terrible things or unjust or treats him with contempt is under his judgment too. That's a hard lesson, especially now. In our day and age, it's hard for us to hear that. But when God's judgments are acted out in a way that sets things right and he repays those, and he says, "Vengeance is mine," right? You don't avenge yourself, I will avenge. And I pray. I know that sometimes we hear of our brothers and sisters in the faith who are suffering for their faith. They're being persecuted in different places of the world. We should love the freedom that God has given to us. That is a gift to us that's unique in all of history. Usually tyrants eventually take over. And it could all be gone in a generation. It really could. Not from outside, but hollowed out from within, if we no longer put the meaning into the things that formed us and the values that we have as we continue to seek to grow and to learn and to become more and more the people that God wants us to be. God wants to bring his saving love to whoever will respond to him in faith. He set this all up because he didn't give up on us. He's a God of grace and mercy who's also holy and not to be mocked or to be trifled with. The Philistines read the wrong messages, and they simply tried to do problem solving in their own minds, their own way, instead of turning to the source, the one that they were seeking to appease, who would have gladly, I think, told them and welcomed them, but they were not willing. Amen.